July 11, 1943, on the Gila Plain in Sicily, General Major Paul Conrath directed the Hermann Göring Division's armored response toward the American beachhead. Mediterranean sunlight struck the dry fields white. Tracks tore dust behind the vehicles, and engines rolled over the plain like distant guns. Conrath committed his armor against the landing, and refused to treat the American airborne troops as a decisive danger. His division carried Luftwaffe prestige and the weight of armored vehicles. Against that, the paratroopers appeared lightly armed, scattered men with small weapons facing steel. Later that day, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment came into Sicily amid darkness, anti-aircraft fire, and confusion. Its men gathered what they could find, took ground, and faced the battle on foot. Conrath's formation drove forward, certain that armor would settle the matter. He expected a short fight. Yet an American force was already bearing on Conrath that his armored division had not measured correctly. By August 17, 1943, Axis forces had left Sicily, and the Hermann Göring Division went with them. It was the first retreat in the contest that would reach Anzio in 1944. On July 17, 1943, Colonel Reuben Tucker moved the 504th through Sicily as ground infantry within the American advance. The regiment was not an isolated band of jumpers waiting for another aircraft mission. It belonged to a larger force that could keep fighting after the drop was over. Its men carried the burden of ground seized under fire, ground held through the night, and roads opened for the advance behind them. The 504th contained 3 infantry battalions. That was not the size of Conrath's division. It was not supposed to be. The contrast was visible on the island itself. The Hermann Göring Division had tanks, vehicles, workshops, fuel demands, ammunition needs, and the reputation of a favored Luftwaffe formation. Tucker's regiment had men moving on foot through a campaign where a crossroads, a ridge, and a town entrance could matter as much as a vehicle column. Sicily gave Conrath no empty space in which to recover. Every withdrawal surrendered road room. Every mile given up narrowed the choices for fuel, repair capacity, ammunition, and time. An armored division could still strike hard, but its machinery needed routes that remained open, supplies that arrived, and ground that could be retained after the attack passed through. The American presence was larger than the rifles visible in a field. The 82d Airborne Division's ground coordination had turned its airborne troops into a force Conrath had to meet across the island. The full weight of that fact was not yet visible in July. The German formation still had its armor, its officers, and the confidence of a unit accustomed to being feared. Tucker ordered his regiment forward. 3 battalions moved with him. The island was shrinking around a division, built to move by road. On the night of July 11th, the 504th entered Sicily while the beachhead fight was still alive. Darkness split the regiment. Anti-aircraft fire, rough landings, and confusion scattered men across unfamiliar ground. They came down without the clean order of a parade field and without any promise that the units beside them would be where the plan had placed them. The regiment gathered anyway. Rifles appeared first. Then machine guns, mortars, bazookas, radios, and captured ground. Men who had landed apart found one another by sound, by direction, and by the immediate need to hold whatever position was in their hands. The American airborne force was becoming a ground force, while Conrath's vehicles still raised dust in daylight. The 82d Airborne Division was the parent formation behind those dispersed men. Its name carried a demand that went beyond the jump. The men had to assemble, report, dig in, move when ordered, and remain in the fight after the aircraft had vanished. Sicily tested that demand in darkness before it tested it in open country. Across the Gila Plain, the Hermann Göring Division faced a battlefield it believed armor could decide. Its commander saw airborne troops with limited equipment, not a pressure point that could hold ground through confusion and become part of a widening American line. That judgment gave the German formation its confidence. It also fixed its attention on the wrong measure of strength. Conrath's division still called the paratroopers lightly armed. The 82d Airborne Division stood behind the regiment. Before Sicily asked what those men could hold, it had first made them learn how to find one another after the jump. June 1942, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. On training fields cut into pine country, the Parachute Regiment learned what came after the aircraft disappeared. Men climbed towers, packed chutes, drilled with rifles and machine guns, studied maps, and practiced finding scattered units after a landing. A jump could scatter a battalion across miles of dark ground. The fight began when the survivors found one another. The regiment belonged to the Airborne Division that Major General Matthew Ridgway was shaping into a formation able to fight after the drop. Its soldiers trained to report by radio, establish a perimeter, move through unfamiliar terrain, and hold ground until heavier support reached them. They were not taught to wait for rescue. They were taught to turn confusion into a line. August 15, 1942, Fort Bragg. The division became an airborne formation, and its men carried that new identity into every field problem. Packed equipment had to be recovered. Weapons had to be brought into action. A landing zone had to become a defended position before daylight exposed it. The lesson was severe and simple. Speed meant nothing if the men could not remain after arrival. Later in 1942, Germany built a very different instrument around the name Hermann Göring. Regiment General Göring expanded into an armored formation with tanks, anti-aircraft guns, infantry, vehicles, and the privileges of a favored Luftwaffe command. Its mobility came from engines, fuel, repair crews, and roads able to carry weight. The contrast was not romantic. German armor could move force across open ground with a violence foot soldiers could not match. American airborne troops carried less, but they could appear where a road column had not expected them and fight on the ground once they arrived. Each formation trusted the kind of movement it had been built to make. General Major Paul Conrath could look at that contrast and trust the division bearing Göring's name. His order would have sounded natural in any German command post. Keep the armor moving. The proud name had become an armored formation in 1942. July 12, 1943, Gila, Sicily. The armored attack of the previous day had given General Major Paul Conrath every reason to trust the old calculation. Open ground favored tracked vehicles. A beachhead was still new, its roads unfinished, its positions exposed, and its defenders forced to hold soil they had only just taken. The Hermann Göring Division had been built for precisely that kind of pressure. Its crews did not need to believe that every American position would fall. They needed only to believe that shock would break the landing force before it became a permanent front. Armor pushed toward threatened sectors. German infantry moved with it. The division's anti-aircraft guns and vehicles belonged to a formation designed to strike fast, then use the road behind the attack. Yet the American positions remained. Infantry held ground under pressure. Artillery fire reached sectors under attack. Naval guns supported the beachhead from beyond the shore. Engineers kept the lodgment functioning while the battle moved around it. None of this looked like a single decisive weapon to Conrath. It looked like a stubborn landing force refusing to behave as a landing force should. July 12, 1943, inland from Hela. The Parachute Regiment was gathering into fighting groups after the disordered arrival. Men who had landed apart were no longer measured by the jump. They were measured by the ground they occupied, the weapons they had recovered, and the orders they could receive. Sicily was already becoming a campaign of roads, villages, and ridges, rather than a single morning at the shore. The American Mediterranean operation kept expanding around the German division. Ammunition, radios, engineer support, and trained replacements reached the advancing force. Conrath still had armored vehicles, but every movement demanded fuel, maintenance, and routes that the shrinking island could no longer give freely. Conrath could still tell his staff that the counterstroke had shown what armor could do. On July 12th, 17 days remained before Sicily's evacuation. July 12, 1943, Sicily. The German calculation had produced an answer that did not hold. An armored division had struck the beachhead, yet the beachhead remained. 17 days separated the staff map from the evacuation of the island. The first figure described time available to the German command. The second fact was the ground it had failed to recover. Conrath adjusted to the island rather than admitting defeat. Vehicles had to be preserved for the roads still open. Fuel and repair capacity had to travel with the division. The American line did not vanish under armor, and each mile east reduced the room in which an armored formation could choose its next fight. July 13, 1943, Sicily. The German command faced a campaign moving beyond the first landing crisis. The division could still strike at exposed ground, but it could not convert that striking power into the destruction of the American lodgment. The Americans were holding a beachhead while their operation widened across the island. The regiment that had arrived scattered was now part of the ground force pressing forward. Its soldiers had assembled after darkness, anti-aircraft fire, and broken landings. They had become line infantry in a campaign that rewarded whoever could hold a road, a ridge, or a town entrance after the first contact passed. General Major Paul Conrath could order his staff to preserve the division for the next position. The map still gave him 17 days, but it gave him no way to turn the beachhead back into a German victory. February 16, 1944, Anzio, Italy. The Hermann Göring Division entered a major German counterattack against a perimeter that had already become defended ground. Colonel Reuben Tucker's regiment held positions inside that perimeter as ground infantry. Drainage ditches cut the flat coastal fields. Roads carried ammunition toward gun pits. Engineers strengthened positions while German troops tried to force a way through them. The division lost the freedom to choose a weak point and exploit it alone. Each local advance entered ground already occupied by American infantry, watched by artillery observers, and connected to supply routes that remained open behind the line. German armor and infantry could reach a sector. They could not make that sector remain theirs after the first attack stalled. The counterattack took something more difficult to replace than a vehicle. It took time. German commanders had to commit men and equipment against positions that did not dissolve under the first blow. A force moving forward had to wait for routes, ammunition, fire support, and orders. The defended perimeter turned every pause into an American advantage. The Hermann Göring Division also lost room to concentrate its weight. It had faced a beachhead in Sicily that survived its armored pressure. At Anzio, it faced a larger defended zone. The American line did not depend on one ditch, one road, or one battalion. When German pressure fixed one part of the perimeter, fire could be brought in from elsewhere, and supplies could still reach the troops holding the ground. That changed the character of the German attack. A breakthrough required more than reaching an American position. It required holding the route behind it, moving more forces through it, protecting them from artillery, and sustaining them while the defenders reorganized. The division could still attack. It could no longer attack on terms it controlled. The paperwork of the offensive reflected that loss. Positions had to be identified. Routes had to be kept usable. Supporting weapons had to be brought forward. Every commitment consumed the fuel, ammunition, and repair effort that the division needed for the next attempt. The attack became a sequence of demands upon a formation already fighting inside a contained battle. In the German attackers' reckoning, they were no longer meeting isolated American positions. They were meeting a perimeter that answered as one force. 6th Corps. At Anzio Harbor, ships began unloading into a beachhead that the German command had expected to crush before it could acquire depth. Ammunition came ashore. Food came ashore. Vehicles and construction material came ashore. The Americans could replace what a defended line consumed, while the German attackers had to bring every requirement forward through a contested approach. That was the answer to the beachhead that had refused to break in Sicily. The repeatable force was not an airborne regiment acting alone. It was the corps system that joined infantry, artillery, engineers, supply routes, observers, and command posts into one defense. The paratroopers supplied disciplined ground troops at the front. The larger system made the positions harder to isolate, harder to overrun, and easier to restore after an attack. The Hermann Göring Division could recognize the problem without solving it. A local attack could still push toward a ditch, a road, or a gun position. But once it met American infantry, artillery could be concentrated on the threatened sector. Engineers could repair routes and reinforce positions. Supply could continue moving into the perimeter. The German command could change the point of attack. It could not separate those parts of the defense. The division therefore faced a degrading choice. It could hold back strength and concede the initiative inside the beachhead. It could commit strength and watch that strength enter the same American fire and supply network. Neither choice restored the fast armored decision its prestige had promised. American training added another burden to the German calculation. The airborne troops had learned to assemble, patrol, dig, relay information, and fight as line infantry after the aircraft had gone. At Anzio, those habits mattered more than the jump itself. German pressure did not find scattered troops waiting to be collected. It found units able to report, hold, and call for support while the perimeter remained supplied. The Hermann Göring Division had become one element in repeated attacks against a defense with depth behind it. Its commanders could still order another effort. They could still shift troops toward a threatened sector. But each order led back to defended ground, concentrated fire, and a shorehead receiving the material needed to continue. In the German command's judgment, the beachhead could not be treated as a temporary landing anymore. It had become a position that absorbed attacks and remained supplied. The 82D. By May 1944, the final approach had become procedural. The Hermann Göring Division still belonged to the German force facing the Anzio perimeter. Its men still held weapons, vehicles, and ground. But the position available to their command had narrowed to a choice between defending a threatened sector and finding enough force for another attack. The Americans had held long enough for the perimeter to become a base for movement outward. Colonel Reuben Tucker remained with his regiment through the Anzio campaign. His paratroopers had come to Italy as airborne soldiers and fought there as ground infantry. They held positions with neighboring American units, received supplies through the beachhead, and remained part of the line that the German counterattacks had failed to erase. The institutional crisis was not a single shouted order, it was the collapse of a workable answer. German headquarters could demand another concentration of force, but it could not remove the artillery, the engineers, or the supplies behind the American line. Subordinate units could be moved, but movement itself consumed the routes and time the command no longer possessed. The division's prestige could not create a gap that its attacks had not opened. When the breakout began on May 23rd, the German position at Anzio no longer offered the Hermann Göring Division a way to impose the decision it had sought. American forces moved out from the beachhead after months of containment. The division survived as a division. It withdrew with German forces from the threatened sector. The beachhead remained in American hands. That was the break. The German formation carrying Hermann Göring's name had entered Italy as an armored command, with a reputation for force and movement. At Anzio, it became part of repeated attacks that could not erase an American perimeter. It had not been destroyed by one regiment. It had been forced into a material position that its own command could not solve. The figures were plain. One regiment within an airborne division. 6th Corps held the beachhead from January 22nd until the May breakout. The 504th survived as a regiment. Tucker remained its commander during the campaign. The Hermann Göring Division withdrew from the sector with German forces. German troops who had faced the regiment gave it a name that carried their final assessment. They called them Devils in Baggy Pants, the 504th. The breakout carried the surviving regiment beyond the perimeter it had helped hold. June 4, 1944, Rome, Italy, gave the beachhead its immediate consequence. The American advance entered the capital after the perimeter had held. The figures now read as a final operational balance. 1 beachhead, 133 days. 1 German armored division, unable to erase it. 1 parachute regiment, still a combat formation after Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio. In the days after the breakout, the Hermann Göring Division withdrew, with German forces pulled back from the threatened sector. Its vehicles, infantry, guns, fuel, and repair work had to serve a retreating front rather than the counterstroke expected at the landing.